Have you ever walked into an outdoor? Has anybody ever done that before? Walked into it, like tried to walk into a door that said pull instead of push? Yes. How did that go for you? You hurt? I know many of you have walked into a place that says no entry. But yeah, we have a tendency sometimes not to pay attention to what the signs say on the door. And I've had several instances to where I will be in full-blown conversation, and next thing you know, my face is like smushed up against the door. Or we had magnetic locks on doors, and I had to press a button to open it, and would forget from time to time to press the button, and then I would just leave, grease or oil from my face on the door, which is always fun and embarrassing. But doors have a purpose. So tonight we are looking at Jesus in his statement saying that he is the door. And so it depends also on your translation. It could say door, it could say gate, but it's pretty much the same thing. So let's look at some Old Testament context. Like I told you guys a couple weeks ago, every claim that Jesus makes in these I am statements has a reflection or has something that goes on in the Old Testament he pulls back to help them understand more or to help them understand better. So there's two instances here that we can pull from, both of them in the book of Psalms. One is Psalm 91, 1 through 4. The other is Psalm 127, 7 through 8. So let me read those for you. Psalm 91, 1 through 4 states, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, he is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. Surely he will save you from the fowler's snare and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness will be your shield and rampart." God doesn't literally have feathers, it's personification. A second verse is Psalm 121, 7 through 8. Which says, "The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over you, or watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going both now and forevermore." So both of these verses tie in with what we're talking about tonight because it looks at God and at Jesus as this protection for us. So that things can't just come in and out of our lives to attack us or hurt us, at least to a certain extent. So we're going to switch from the Old Testament context to look more of it in its proper context in the book of John. So turn to John. And we're going to start verses 35 through 41. Do you guys remember what I was talking about with the blind man last week? Does anybody remember that? Well, let's read those verses. We'll start in verse 35. So at this point, Jesus has already healed the blind man. The blind man went to the Pharisees to show them that he had been healed so that he can go to the synagogue. And they get angry at him because he's talking about Jesus. So it says, Jesus heard that they had put him out, so they had kicked him out of the synagogue anyway. And finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you." And he said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. And Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, so that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Those of the Pharisees who were with him heard these things and said to him, "We are not blind too, are we?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no sin, but since you say we see, your sin remains." So this is setting up this conversation that Jesus is about to have, not only with the Pharisees, but also with the people around him. There are these Pharisees that know the truth, and yet they've allowed themselves to become spiritually blind. They don't care. They think they know all the answers, so instead of actually seeing God, they ignore him because they don't want to change. They think that what they have going on is more important. They have all the power and the authority that they want, and nothing else matters to them. So let's get into what we're talking about tonight in Jesus' I am statement. So he calls himself the door, calls himself the gate. And to us, this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, when you think about a door or a gate, it's not the same context necessarily that they had in the Old Testament. And so Jesus uses examples in his teaching to help them better understand what's going on. So it's like using an example that we would now, or using a simile or a metaphor or something that we would relate to. So things that you're interested in. So like if somebody goes and does FCA for the football team, they're probably going to have some kind of reference to football. Jesus does that throughout the New Testament or in the four Gospels to help people understand in their context what's going on. And so he does that again here. And so he uses a door to explain that Christianity is an exclusive religion. And what that means is that there is only one way to God. There's nothing else. You can't get there based on good works. You can't get there because you have some kind of side deal with God. You can't get there because you're better than somebody else. You can't get there because you come to church. It is only through Christ that we can get to God. And so Christianity is an exclusive religion. There's no other way except Jesus. And so this is really what he's talking about tonight. And so in the same manner that Jesus took the blind man and brought him into his flock, After being rejected by the religious leaders, he offers the crowd the same opportunity. And to this day, he continues offering us this opportunity. So let's talk about what this looked like. So in that time, in biblical times, and even still now, there are two types of pens that shepherds use. So you see in the picture, this is what a pen would look like back then. And this is actually a modern day photo. So you can see how it kind of wraps around and then there's one opening to it. And so even back then, they had the same setup to where they would take their sheep inside of the pen, and sometimes they would spend the night out there if it was too far to go back to the town, or they would hire someone to watch their sheep overnight so that they could sleep. And so what that person would do, whether it was the shepherd or the guard, they would lay across the opening so that nothing could get in and nothing could get out. And so there's two types of pens. There's the public pen. This would hold multiple flocks at one time. It's kind of like daycare for your kids, or your parents take you there. There will be a guard or a night watch, a hired hand for those flocks so the shepherd could get some sleep. Shepherds would come back, they would call to their sheep, and the sheep would know their voice, which that's a really interesting thing, and we'll talk about that more next week. But the shepherd would speak, the sheep would know their voice, they would walk out of the pen to their shepherd. And then there's also the ones that are in the countryside. So the second type of pen. Where the sheep would be kept here at night during good weather. It would be a rough circle of rocks stacked up into a wall with a small open space at the center. So very much like this one is here. Shepherds would lay at the opening to keep wild animals out and keep the sheep in at night. So he would literally become the door. So nothing could get in and nothing could get out. So let's dive into the scripture. So he talks about in the first five verses that there's two types of people. You've got your party crashers and you've got your invited guests. So let's read verses 1 through 5 in chapter 10. Truly, truly, I say to you, whenever Jesus says truly, truly, what does that mean? It's very important. He who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. So let's talk about this. Have you guys ever been to a party where you were not invited? Well, if you have, it can be awkward. But what happens is there's a term for this, and what that's called is a party crasher. So it's a person who attends a party without being invited. And sometimes they either want to be the center of attention, and so they look like this guy. They cause disruptions because they think they're more important than everything else. Or they sit quietly because they don't want any kind of attention. They just want to be included. So those are the types of people. So Jesus tells the crowd that there are two types that are trying to enter the sheep pen without going through the door. These party crashers are people who are trying to get into the sheep pen without going through the door because they know that if they try to go through the door, they're not going to be welcomed. They're not going to be able to go through it. And so he calls these two groups of people thieves and robbers. Neither of these is a good term. These are people who go in to steal and to sometimes kill and obviously destroy. So we get some context here going back to the Old Testament in Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 2 through 5. And it says, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to those shepherds, this is what the Lord God says. Woe, shepherds of Israel, or warning, shepherds of Israel, who have been feeding themselves. Should the shepherds not feed the flock? You eat the fat and clothe yourselves with the wool. You slaughter the fat sheep without feeding the flock. Those who are sickly you have not strengthened. The diseased you have not healed. The broken you have not bound up. The scattered you have not brought back. Nor have you searched for the lost, but with force and with violence you have dominated them. They scattered for lack of a shepherd, and they became food for every animal on the field and scattered. So there was these kings, these priests, these prophets who were lying to Israel for personal gain. Instead of telling them the truth, they cared more about being wealthy. They cared more about having power, having authority, having attention. And instead of telling the people what they needed to hear from God, they ignored God and told them what they felt like they wanted to tell them. And so all this did was hurt the people and cause them to scatter because they had no idea who to follow. They didn't know what the truth was anymore, and so they were following after everything. And so the sheep scattered and they no longer could hear God's voice. Verse 10 in Ezekiel 34 gives God's response to the lack of shepherd care for the flock. So these people who are acting irresponsibly, he tells what's going to happen. Behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will demand my sheep from them and make them cease from feeding sheep. So the shepherds will feed themselves, or will not feed themselves anymore, but I will deliver my flock from their mouth so that they will not be food for them. So he's saying that all of these leaders, all these kings, all these prophets, God is going to remove them from the equation so they can no longer deceive people, so they can no longer profit off of his people. And ultimately what that means is he's going to take their lives. He's going to kill them because God does not take false teaching lightly. He was fed up with people that were in power and said he would strip them of their power and authority so that he would take care of his sheep himself. Jesus came to be that shepherd to feed the flock. Jesus came to be the king, the priest, the leader that these men could not be. And he would take care of the sick, the diseased, the broken, the scattered, and the dominated. And so the person that goes through the door, the person that is able to go through the door of the gate of the sheep pen is not a thief or a robber, but he is an invited guest. He's the one who can stand before the gatekeeper and be allowed entrance. The gatekeeper recognizes this person and allows him to come in to the walls of the pen. So you get an invitation to a party, you're welcomed in because you belong there, because you're supposed to be there. And so this is what's going on here. To be allowed into the pen as a shepherd, the gatekeeper had to know him. You get invited to parties and places that people know you. It's the same way with this. We are invited, if we are believers, into the sheep pen because God knows us. If God does not know us, we do not get invited. And no matter how hard you try to jump the fence or sneak in, you're not going to make it. Same thing with these thieves and robbers. But there had to be trust. And the gatekeeper could quickly tell if a man was true shepherd or not. Because like I was telling you earlier, the sheep can hear and understand the shepherd's voice. So if you were to walk up and say, hey, I've got 50 sheep in the sheep pen, and you start speaking, but none of the sheep move, the gatekeeper knows that you're a liar and knows you don't belong there. It's the same way with us in our faith. If we tell people that we're a Christian, and yet when people look at our lives and they see no evidence of that, we're lying. And don't think that you can get before God and fool him into thinking that you're a Christian. God knows the truth. God knows who you really are, whether anyone else does or not. And so we can't fool God, and these shepherds could not fool the person keeping the sheep in the gate. And so we've got to make sure that we know what we're talking about and what we're doing. And so the sheep would never follow the voice of someone that is not their master, which is why the robber or the thief must steal them away. If we truly understand our faith and truly know who Jesus is, we don't have to worry about being led astray because we're not going to listen to false voices. But people that don't take their faith seriously, if they actually have it, are always going to be led astray because they don't know who to listen to. They don't know what the truth is. So the question here is, whose voice are we following? Are you following the voice of the shepherd or someone else? And there's so much noise in the world. There's so many half-truths and blatant lies that sound like truth. You can go on the internet and try to research something, and you've got to filter through what everything is to make sure that what you're looking at is genuinely true. I mean, the media is a big proponent of this now. I think Facebook just got in trouble because they were being strong-armed by the FBI or something to promote a certain political party over another. And then there was proof that just came out about it. So you can't trust what's out there because everything is being curated and manipulated to make you think a certain way. Which is why we need to study ourselves when it comes to our faith, which is why we need to read our Bible, which is why we need to make sure that we're researching and understanding what we believe, because you could have somebody stand on the stage and completely lie to you. And if you never actually do the research yourself and go back and read it to try to understand it, you're going to believe something that may not be true. There are thousands, if not more, people that believe that when we die, we become angels. That's not true. But I've seen so many posts over the years to where someone dies and they're, well, God gained another angel. It's not true. We don't become angels. We are different from angels. But because those people didn't do the research, because they were not listening to the right voice, they're believing something that's not true. So you've got to do your research. You've got to take your faith seriously so that you can distinguish between a lie and the truth, between a thief or a robber and the true shepherd. So we need to learn how to discern God's voice. And so after he talks about robbers and thieves, he talks about doors and destruction. So let's look at verses 6 through 10. He says, this figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were, which he had been saying to them. So confusion strikes. Has anybody ever said anything and you just kind of look at them like the dog does when they don't really understand? Kind of shift your head to the side. This happens with Jesus a lot. And I feel like it happens with your parents sometimes too, when they tell you something and you don't really understand what to do, or you just decide not to do it. But this isn't anything new. We see this all the time in the Gospels. There's time and time again to where Jesus tells people things, to where he tells the disciples things, and they just really don't get it. They don't understand. And so he goes again to clarify it. So he explains things to the listeners, but it may not click at that time. There may be things that someone tells you that you don't understand until later on when you had time to think about it. And this is really what's happening with the crowd. They're so used to everything being physical that they don't understand the spiritual aspect. It was the same thing with the bread. It's the same thing with the woman at the well. If you guys have read that recently, they don't understand that there is a spiritual aspect to this. And so it had people confused and they're scratching their heads. As a side note, there's going to be times where you read the Bible or you hear something, whether it's myself, another pastor, or a person says, and you're not going to fully understand it. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to ask for clarification. It's okay to ask God questions. There are some times where we don't understand everything that's going on and we get angry or we get upset with God, but it's okay. He can take it. And he wants you to come to him. He wants you to ask questions because he's right there beside you if you're a believer. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to have clarity. And here's what I've learned. I've always been the kid in school that if I had a question, I didn't care if anybody else had that question or not, I was going to ask it, especially in college and grad school because I wanted to get my money's worth. And I would ask the question, but what I came to find out is that if you have a question, more than likely somebody else has got that question too. And they just aren't brave enough to ask or they don't have the courage to ask. So if you have a question, it's okay, as long as it's related to what we're talking about. But ask questions. That's how you're going to develop your faith and how you're going to grow and how you're going to learn what you believe. It's by asking questions. And so he tells them to ask questions. So that's what the listeners did. They told Jesus they did not understand. So he clarified it for them. So let's look at verse 7. So Jesus said to them again, truly, truly, it's important. I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. So now Jesus lays it all out. He's the door, the one that stands in the way of the sheep getting out and being devoured by robbers or being stolen or just kind of wandering away. Because I don't know if you know this or not, but sheep are kind of dumb. I was reading something a while back that said if one sheep were to run off a cliff, then all the other sheep would follow him. Because they're followers. That one sheep doesn't know what's going on, so they take off. The rest of them follow them because they want to fit in with the crowd, and they all die. But sheep are not the smartest animals in the world, and which is also interesting because Jesus calls us sheep as well. So there's a very interesting correlation there. But he lays everything out for him. Jesus stands in the gap to protect us, to allow us to have security and to feel safe and to be at peace. We don't have to worry about wandering off because Jesus stands in the way. If we're part of his flock, there's no way we can get out. Once we know Christ as our shepherd, we don't have to listen to the other voices in the world. We don't have to wonder if what the world is doing is better than what we're doing. Because at some point, all the things that the world is doing is going to be destroyed. And all that's going to be left is God and his followers. Everything else is going to be separated for eternity. So if your focus is on wanting to fit in with the rest of the world, don't. Because it's not worth it. It's not worth what you're going to sacrifice. Jesus says people come to steal, kill, and destroy, and that's really not what we should be seeking after. It's not what we should be chasing. So as a follower of Christ, if you are one, you can have security in knowing that Christ holds your salvation and no one can take it from him. That means that if you make a mistake, you're not going to lose your salvation. That means that if you make a mistake, Jesus is going to be there to help pick you up. And he's going to help guide you where you need to go. And he's going to walk beside you and do those things to get you to be the man or the woman of God that he's called you to be. Also, this means that Jesus serves as the sole means of a salvation. We can only approach God through Christ. And so there's no other way we can do that. It's only through him. And so he leads us in and out of the sheep pen. He calls us, and if we are of his flock, we will follow joyfully. The reason why a lot of people can't figure out God's will in their life is because a lot of them made a decision that they didn't understand or they didn't make a legitimate decision to begin with. If we have no desire to take our faith seriously, then we're not a follower of Christ. Because when Jesus hung on that cross and was crucified for you and for me, it was not for people to be haphazard Christians. It was not for us to think that I can be a Christian on Wednesday or on Sunday, but I can do whatever I want to the rest of the week. When you go through the Gospels and see what Jesus said, he told us that we need to be ready to bear the cross. That means that we need to be willing to lay our lives down for Christ. And if we're not willing to do that, then we really need to look and see if we truly believe that Jesus is who he says he is. Because God gave everything so that we could be redeemed to him, and yet we're not willing to give anything. God does not need us. He is not begging for us to follow him. At the end of the day, God is just as content without us as he is with us. And so we need to take our faith seriously if you truly are a believer. Because otherwise, why believe in the first place? If you don't hear the shepherd's voice, if you have no desire to listen to God speak and listen to God lead you and listen to God guide you, then why claim to be something that you're not? And that's what Jesus is telling us. If we are going to call ourselves Christians, we need to be 100% sold out. Because he needs people who are going to legitimately follow him, not people that just like a title. So let that be your challenge. If you call yourself a Christian, take it seriously. Don't play around and do everything else, because when you stand before God, we're going to be held accountable for those things. And God's a lot more terrifying than I am. He is a loving God, but he's also a righteous God. But he is the door. He stands in the gap that if we are believers, he keeps us safe and keeps us protected. And he leads us and we follow joyfully. And what's interesting about shepherds in the Middle East or the Near East, which is including in Israel, is that they lead from the front. Shepherds in the West, they lead from the back and drive the sheep wherever they're supposed to go. But the shepherds in the Near East, they actually go out in front of their sheep and lead them where they're supposed to go. And what's a very cool correlation here is that when you go back to Ezekiel where God is talking about the false leaders and the false shepherds, they're pushing Israel into a direction, but they're not willing to go with them. And what Jesus is doing is he's leading out front, saying, I will live a righteous life. I will live a perfect life. I will die for your sins. I will show you how to be redeemed to the Father. That way you can follow me. Follow my lead. And that's what he tells us to do. Jesus says for us to follow him. And so going from the door to the wrong exit, let's look at verse 8. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. Jesus tells the crowd that those prophets, those leaders that came before him, like I said, were thieves and they were robbers. He's talking about false prophets and kings that had no desire to lead his people to him. There are people that take positions of authority that have no desire to see you benefit and no desire to lead you where you need to go in your faith. If we don't know how to identify those people, how are we going to know if they're false teachers? That's the exact same thing that Dr. Waters was talking about Sunday. We need to be able to discern the difference between someone who is truly teaching what God has called them to teach and someone who is teaching false gospels. Someone who is teaching an untruth and it's going to deceive us and it's not going to help us get where we need to go. But we've got to be able to tell that. But he tells them the sheep did not listen to their voices. So there were many people that were led astray by false teachers, but there are also some that stayed faithful. So there were some that may have never been God's sheep to begin with, but there are also those that stayed faithful throughout all of it that did not listen to the false prophets. And most of them ended up losing their lives. They were killed for what they believed. And so by the final verdict, let's look at verses 9 and 10. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. If you go to and through the correct door, which is Christ, you will be saved. In the same manner that the sheep, when they went into the sheep pen, they were kept safe by their shepherd. Christ is not going to drop the ball on your salvation. The sheep will be able to come and go as the shepherd leads. It will never have to worry about being led astray. The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Some think that this is talking about Satan. Others think it may be talking about false teachers. I honestly think it's talking about both. Obviously, the devil is the main liar, the main deceiver, the main deceptor, the person that is trying to do everything he can to keep you from getting where you need to go. He desires to steal people away from hearing the voice of Jesus and becoming part of the flock. He only has death and destruction to offer people. But how many of us get enticed by death and destruction? What the world offers may be enticing, but it'll lead you to death. Go through and read Proverbs, like chapter 5, 6, 7, 8, that talks about what sin can do to a person. And everything it says is that it leads them to the pit, leads them to hell. That's what the world has to offer. It may look shiny and it may look new, but eventually that's going to wear off and you're going to realize that it's a lot worse than you thought. But these people, if they continue to listen to Jesus' voice, they're going to be led, or to the false teacher's voice, they're going to be led right to death. If we continue to allow the wrong voices to influence us, if we continue to allow the wrong voices to guide us and to entice us and to persuade us, it's going to lead us to death, which is hell. It's going to lead us to spiritual death for those that are unbelievers. Jesus says that he came that you may have life and have it abundantly. This does not mean just to live, just to breathe. This means to thrive. That means to grow in your relationship with Christ. That means to be able to look at people and share the gospel with them. That means to be able to actually have excitement and joy over the fact that you're a believer. He gives us that. And he helps us to be able to share that with other people so that they can understand what it's supposed to look like to be a follower of Christ. And then we have the opportunity to share that with them and to see more people come to know Christ. I'm going to leave you with this thought. Whose voice are you listening to? Are you listening to the voice of Christ or the thief? Are you protected in the sheep pen, or are you wandering around in the wilderness, waiting to be snatched up by a thief or a robber?